Every World War II movie you've ever watched has been lying to you about tanks. Not small, harmless exaggerations, but complete fabrications that would have gotten real crews killed in minutes. For 8 decades, Hollywood has been recycling the same myths, the same explosions, and the same false physics until millions believe that's how armored combat really worked. It wasn't, because the truth is, tank warfare wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. And it definitely wasn't cinematic. It was slow, nerve-shredding, and claustrophobic. Inside a tank, your world shrank to a few inches of glass, a handful of levers, and the deafening echo of steel. Every move had to be deliberate, every decision measured. Yet on screen, tanks race across fields, firing on the move, erupting in fireballs, and smashing into each other like mechanical gladiators. That's not history. That's choreography. Hollywood has fed audiences a demolition derby version of war. Tanks that roar across the countryside, trading shots at full speed, shells that always hit and always explode, commanders with perfect visibility, barking orders like conductors of chaos. It's thrilling, but it's fantasy. The real story, what tank crews actually endured, is quieter, colder, and far more terrifying. For the men who fought in steel, every second inside a tank meant risk. The armor might protect you, but it also trapped you. Visibility was near zero. The air was hot and heavy with fumes. The moment a round penetrated the hull, the tank became a tomb. There were no dramatic explosions, no soaring music, just smoke, silence, and the sound of metal tearing open. But Hollywood doesn't sell fear or futility. It sells spectacle. So for generations, audiences have learned a cinematic version of tank warfare that never existed. The result? Decades of myths now accepted as fact. It's time to put them in the ground. We're digging into 5 of the biggest lies that movies keep telling about. Tanks, from the high-speed duel to the fiery death trap. And by the end, you'll see just how far film fiction drifts from battlefield reality. Let's start with the most popular illusion of all, the high-speed tank duel. Think of the tank battles you've seen in movies. Fury, Kelly's Heroes, Saving Private Ryan. Tanks racing across open fields, turrets swiveling, shells flying as they bounce over mud and craters. Engines roar, metal collides, and the crews shout commands like cowboys in armored wagons. It looks thrilling, fast, chaotic, unstoppable. Now forget all of it. Because not one frame of that reflects how tanks actually fought. Real tank battles were never high-speed duels. They weren't drag races with cannons. They were slow, methodical, and often fought at a crawl. The truth is simple. Firing a tank gun while moving was nearly impossible to do accurately. A World War II era. Sherman tank rolling at just 10 miles per hour had less than a 1% chance, 1%, of hitting a stationary target at 500 meters. Every bump, every rut, every jolt in the track shifted the aim by degrees that meant total misses. A single rock could send a shell flying wildly off target. Tank guns of that era didn't have modern stabilizers, computers, or laser rangefinders. They relied on mechanical sights, manual range estimates, and the gunner's muscle control. Even the smallest motion turned precision into luck. The Germans learned that lesson early. Their armored manuals formally forbade firing on the move, except in desperate situations. Crews were trained to halt before shooting. They called it shoot and scoot. Move into cover, stop, aim, fire, and relocate. Ammunition was limited, and every shell wasted on a moving shot was one they couldn't afford to lose. Veterans described the rhythm like this. We moved. We halted. We aimed. We shot over and over. It wasn't cinematic. It was chess under fire. Each side waited for the other to make the wrong move first. Whoever spotted first, aimed first, and fired first usually won. And those charging duels Hollywood adores? In real life, tanks avoided them at all costs. Moving fast across open ground only made you easier to see and hit. A tank's armor was strongest at the front, weakest on the sides and rear. Speed exposed those weak points. The smarter move was always to stay low, stay still, and strike first. Even the American M4 Sherman's famous gyro stabilizer, a device often portrayed as a game-changing invention, didn't make tanks accurate while moving. It wasn't a precision system. It merely helped keep the gun roughly pointed forward while the tank jolted along. Useful for faster re-aiming after a stop, yes, but it didn't turn a Sherman into a sniper on tracks. Hollywood ignores that. Because slow doesn't sell. A real tank fight would look like this. 2 armored beasts creeping forward, stopping often, scanning, firing a single shot, then backing away into cover. Minutes of tension for seconds of action. The movies turned that into a demolition derby with guns, a ballet of chaos. In truth, it was a duel of patience and nerves. Crews inside the tanks rarely saw their targets clearly. Often the only clue a hit had landed was a puff of smoke in the distance or the sudden silence of an enemy gun. One veteran summed it up perfectly. You didn't fight fast. You fought careful. Fast got you killed. So the next time you see a Sherman drifting across a field, firing flawlessly on the move, remember, the real crews who fought in those machines would have called that suicide. Tank warfare wasn't about speed. It was about stillness, precision, and the courage to sit exposed while aiming for a single perfect shot. And when that shot did hit, the result wasn't a fiery explosion lighting up the sky. It was quieter, crueler, and far less cinematic. That brings us to the next myth. One Hollywood just can't resist. The idea that one hit equals a fireball. In the movies, every time a tank gets hit, it's the same spectacular sight. One shell connects and suddenly, boom! A towering explosion. Flames shoot skyward. The turret lifts off the hull like a tossed coin. The crew is obliterated in an instant. It's cinematic gold, the kind of explosion audiences expect. But that image is a lie. A beautiful, fiery, physics-defying lie. In real life, most tanks didn't explode when hit. They didn't erupt into fireballs or cartwheel their turrets through the air. More often, a hit simply punched a hole through the armor, sent deadly fragments ricocheting inside, and left the tank silent. No fireworks, no blaze, just a steel shell filled with smoke, blood, and dust. U.S. Army studies from 1944 and 1945 found that only about 15% of Sherman tanks knocked out in combat actually caught fire. The rest didn't burn. They were just disabled or destroyed internally. When a shell penetrated the armor, the spall or shattered fragments of steel tore through everything inside. Those splinters killed or wounded the crew long before any explosion could occur. Even the infamous nickname Ronson, supposedly meaning lights the first time every time, was more myth than fact. Early in the war, Shermans did have a tendency to catch fire, but not because of gasoline, as Hollywood loves to imply. The fires usually came from ammunition igniting when a shell struck the storage racks. Sherman crews carried dozens of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds. When those were hit, they cooked off, burning violently, sometimes for hours. But that wasn't the same as a tank instantly detonating like a bomb. It was slow, uneven, and horrifyingly quiet compared to the explosions Hollywood imagines. By late 1944, engineers fixed even that problem. They introduced wet ammunition storage, racks surrounded by a thin layer of antifreeze solution. It sounds crude, but it worked. The rate of post-hit fires dropped from nearly 60% to under 10%. In other words, by the final year of the war, Shermans were no more likely to burn than German panzers. Yet the legend lived on. Fire looks better on camera, smoke sells drama, and directors love a good explosion. In film after film, tanks don't just get destroyed. They detonate as if every machine were sitting on a mountain of TNT. But the truth was far deadlier and far less cinematic. Inside a tank, death rarely came with a flash. It came with fragments, heat, and silence. The interior would fill with smoke so thick crews couldn't see their own hands. The smell of fuel, paint, and flesh blended into something indescribable. Survivors often said they didn't even realize they'd been hit until they noticed their crewmates weren't moving. Imagine a Hollywood version of that. A tank struck. No explosion, no dramatic music, just a jolt. A hiss and everything going still. It doesn't make for great theater, but it's what real warfare looked like. Even the few tanks that did burn didn't explode outward. The pressure built slowly, cooking off ammunition one round at a time. Sometimes an ammunition rack would eventually blow, but by then, the crew was long gone and the battle had moved on. So, while movies show tanks bursting apart like fireworks, the grim reality was much quieter. Most armored deaths weren't cinematic. They were suffocating. That's the difference between myth and memory. Hollywood gives us flash and fire. History gives us physics and finality. And just as movies exaggerate explosions, they also overstate another favorite fantasy. The idea that tank guns could blast straight through buildings as if walls were paper. Let's expose that next. If you've watched any World War II movie, you've seen this scene. A tank rumbles up to a town square. Enemy soldiers hide inside a building. The commander yells, "Target that house!" The gun fires, the shell tears through one wall, then another, and bursts out the far side in a spectacular explosion. The audience cheers. Hollywood magic. But physics says otherwise. In real life, tank rounds didn't behave that way. They didn't punch clean holes through multiple walls or travel through buildings like giant rifle bullets. Most tank shells detonated on impact, the instant they hit solid material. Brick, stone, concrete, or even heavy timber could trigger the fuse, causing the round to explode right at the surface. Take the American M4 Sherman 75mm gun, for example. Its standard high-explosive shell carried about 1.5 pounds of TNT. When it hit a brick wall, it didn't keep going. It blew a hole in the outer layer and stopped there. The explosion might knock out a section of the wall or send debris flying, but it wouldn't continue through another room, another wall, and out the far side of the building. Even the German 88mm cannon, legendary for its velocity and power, wasn't some unstoppable laser. Armor-piercing shells could penetrate steel, yes, but when they hit stone or concrete, they fragmented and lost energy fast. After one wall, sometimes even half of one, the projectile broke apart. Real tank combat in urban areas was nothing like the movies. Crews didn't try to shoot through buildings to hit hidden enemies. Instead, they used high-explosive rounds to collapse the structure onto those enemies. It was less about marksmanship and more about demolition. Tankers called it knocking down cover. The goal wasn't to snipe through a window, it was to erase the building entirely. One veteran described it simply: "You didn't shoot through a house, you took the house down." For defenders inside those structures, the difference was catastrophic. A single hit could blow out entire floors or turn walls into avalanches of brick and dust. But even that was far less cinematic than the clean, fiery shots Hollywood loves to show. German panzer commanders often exploited this misunderstanding. As one officer later recalled, "The Americans assumed we could punch through their cover. We let them assume. In reality, we maneuvered around." That's how real tank warfare worked: less spectacle, more psychology. You didn't waste shells showing off. You repositioned, outflanked, and used indirect fire. In cities like Stalingrad, Cannes, and Aachen, tank crews fired at corners, doorways, and rooftops, anywhere defenders might be hiding. It was methodical destruction, not theatrical chaos. On film, tanks are portrayed as unstoppable cannons capable of slicing through stone and steel. In truth, every shot was a trade-off. Every shell fired revealed your position. Every explosion risked attracting anti-tank guns or infantry, with Panzerfausts waiting in alleys. The idea of blasting through 3 buildings in a row wasn't bravery, it was suicide. And yet, for Hollywood, nothing beats a clean, cinematic angle. A tank shell flying through multiple rooms and emerging in slow motion on the other side. It looks powerful, satisfying, and heroic. The reality was messier, slower, and far more dangerous. So no, tanks didn't shoot through buildings. They destroyed them from the outside, one crumbling wall at a time. The real weapon wasn't precision, it was pressure, firepower, and fear. And speaking of fear, Hollywood also loves to show tank crews as calm and confident. Commanders standing tall, scanning the battlefield with perfect visibility. But in reality, those men were nearly blind. Let's move to the next myth: the illusion of visibility. In the movies, tank crews always look like they've got a perfect view of the battlefield. The commander stands tall in the turret, scanning the horizon. The gunner swings his sights smoothly from target to target. The driver steers confidently as if navigating with a panoramic windshield. From the outside, tanks look unstoppable, machines with eyes everywhere. Reality couldn't be more different. Inside a World War II tank, the world narrowed down to slits, prisms, and mirrors the size of your hand. You didn't see the battlefield, you guessed where it was. A Sherman driver, for example, peered through a vision slit just 4 inches wide. The gunner looked through an optic barely the size of a dinner plate. Fine for a single fixed target, useless for scanning terrain. The commander's cupola had periscopes, but each offered only a few degrees of view. To see all around, he had to rotate the entire turret or physically turn himself in the hatch. When a tank buttoned up, meaning all hatches were closed for protection, the crew might as well have been inside a steel coffin. Their combined field of vision was less than 20% of what an infantryman outside could see. That blindness had deadly consequences. German field trials during the war found that buttoned-up tank crews missed 60% of visible targets in combat conditions. Entire enemy platoons could be hiding just a few hundred meters away, and no one inside would ever know. That's why many commanders risked their lives by standing half exposed in the open hatch. They'd pop their heads out, scanning for threats, binoculars in hand, knowing that every sniper in the area was looking right back at them. But they did it anyway, because the alternative was driving blind. One commander put it bluntly: inside, you see the world through a toilet paper tube. Outside, you invite snipers. We chose snipers. Hollywood rarely shows that claustrophobia. In movies, everything looks clean and organized. The optics are crystal clear and the inside of the tank is brightly lit. In truth, the interior was dim, smoky, and loud. The heat could reach 50 degrees Celsius. The smell of oil, sweat, and exhaust filled every breath. You didn't see your targets, you felt them. The vibrations, the rattle of incoming rounds, the metallic clangs against the armor. Crews developed instincts instead of sight. Drivers memorized terrain from brief glimpses before buttoning up. Commanders used radio chatter to map the battlefield in their minds. Gunners learned to anticipate where enemies should be rather than where they could actually see them. And when the shooting started, everything shrank even further. The noise was deafening. Communication was reduced to hand signals and shouted commands. The gunner saw nothing but his sight. The loader focused on shells. The driver could only watch the slit in front of him, hoping no shell came through it. So no, tanks weren't metal fortresses with perfect visibility. They were moving bunkers, blind, slow, and isolated. Inside, you didn't feel like a hunter. You felt like prey. But Hollywood likes clean vision, smooth action, and confidence. The truth is dirtier, darker, and filled with panic. That blindness, more than anything, defined tank warfare. Crews weren't fearless, they were trapped. Half blind inside the most dangerous vehicles on the battlefield. And if Hollywood has convinced you that tanks smashed into each other like gladiators when vision failed, well, that's the next myth to bury, because in real combat, ramming wasn't a tactic of bravery. It was a tactic of desperation. Few things look more dramatic on screen than two tanks charging toward each other, engines roaring, treads chewing through the mud, steel colliding in a thunderous crash. Sparks fly. One tank flips over, the other rolls forward in triumph. It's pure adrenaline and pure fiction. In real life, tank ramming was never a tactic. It was a last resort, a desperate act when everything else had failed. Let's start with simple physics. A 30-ton tank moving at 25 miles per hour carries enormous momentum. Yes, but the armor and suspension weren't built for impact. Tanks weren't bumper cars. Their hulls could crack, their treads could shear, and their turrets could jam. Even a glancing collision could disable both vehicles. During World War II, crews knew this well. Their tanks were expensive, fragile machines requiring constant maintenance. A single ramming strike could knock a transmission out of alignment or damage the main gun. The idea that a commander would choose to ram another tank when one shell could do the job from hundreds of meters away was unthinkable. And yet, Hollywood keeps showing it. From Fury to Saving Private Ryan, the tank duel almost always ends with one tank smashing into the other. It looks thrilling. But in actual warfare, closing that distance was suicidal. Tank duels weren't point-blank brawls, or they were long-range chess matches. In most engagements, the first tank to see and shoot the other won. The Germans even had a phrase for it: Der erste Schuss zählt, and the first shot counts. There was no cinematic circling, no heroic ramming, just careful positioning, one decisive pull of the trigger, and silence. That's not to say collisions never happened. They did, but almost always by accident or desperation. In the chaos of urban combat, tanks sometimes crashed into obstacles or even friendly vehicles when visibility failed. At night in smoke or fog, a tank might ram into a wreck or enemy position simply because it couldn't stop in time. Occasionally, when ammunition ran out or a tank was immobilized, the crew might try to use the machine itself as a weapon, but that was suicide. One of the rare documented cases came from the Battle of Kursk in 1943. A Soviet T-34, its gun jammed and tracks damaged, rammed a German Panzer III in a last act of defiance. Both tanks were destroyed. The Soviet crew died instantly. Historians noted it as bravery but not strategy. Even in the late war years, when desperation grew, commanders avoided close-range collisions. The moment a tank got that close, infantry with grenades or Panzerfausts became the real threat. Getting near an enemy tank wasn't bravery. It was an open invitation to die. But movies need spectacle. A tank sitting still in a field and firing one perfect shot doesn't fill a theater. Two tanks slamming together, though? That's drama. That's sound and fury. And that's why ramming became one of cinema's favorite lies. In truth, tank warfare was rarely up close. It was about who saw first, who fired first, and who had the steadier nerves. When tanks did collide, it was usually chaos, smoke, confusion, and fear, not glory. A veteran once said, "You didn't ram the enemy. You prayed you never had to see him that close." That sums it up better than any movie ever could. So no, tanks didn't duel by ramming. They stalked each other at distance, hiding behind hills, trading shots across fields. The real fight wasn't about who hit hardest. It was about who spotted first. And that leads us to the next myth. One Hollywood never gets right either. The idea that tank shells always exploded like fireworks. Because the truth is, most of them didn't explode at all. If you've watched any war movie in the last 80 years, you already know how it goes. A tank takes a hit, and boom, flames erupt. The turret rockets into the sky. The entire vehicle vanishes in a ball of fire. It's spectacular. It's horrifying. And it's almost entirely wrong. The truth about tanks in World War II was far less cinematic, and far more terrifying in its quietness. When an armor-piercing round struck a tank, it didn't necessarily explode. Most of the time it simply punched through. The impact created a small entry hole, sometimes no larger than a coin, but what happened inside was hell on earth. The high-velocity round tore through steel, sending a storm of molten fragments and shrapnel ricocheting through the crew compartment. In an instant, anyone inside could be shredded by spall, razor-sharp steel splinters traveling faster than bullets. The result wasn't a Hollywood fireball. It was silent, efficient death. American battlefield studies conducted after the war revealed the shocking numbers. Only about 15% of Sherman tanks that were knocked out actually caught fire. The rest? They were simply penetrated, their crews killed or wounded, their machines rendered lifeless but intact. Even the infamous Ronson nickname, "Lights the first time, every time," was largely an exaggeration. The myth came from early combat reports before major design upgrades. In the early years of the war, Sherman tanks did have a nasty habit of burning, but not because they were made of weak armor or ran on gasoline. The real culprit was ammunition storage. Rounds were stored in unprotected racks, and when a shell penetrated the hull, it often struck that ammunition, igniting the propellant inside. By 1944, engineers introduced wet storage, surrounding the shells with a glycol water mixture that prevented fires. After that upgrade, the number of Shermans that burned dropped to under 10%. But Hollywood didn't update its facts. Filmmakers kept the old image, tanks exploding like fuel trucks, because it looked better on screen. The Germans faced similar realities. Even their mighty Panthers and Tigers rarely burst into flames unless the ammunition or fuel was hit directly. Most tanks simply stopped moving. Smoke might pour from the hatches, but the spectacle ended there. For the men inside, though, that quiet aftermath was worse than any explosion. Survivors described an eerie stillness after impact, the smell of burnt insulation, the hiss of steam from ruptured lines, and the sight of their crewmates motionless beside them. No thunderous fireball, no dramatic Hollywood death, just the slow realization that their world had ended in seconds. German reports called these encounters Stahlgewitter, steel storms, where a single hit could end a crew's life before they even knew they'd been struck. In one report from Normandy, a Panther was found with its crew still seated, all killed instantly by spall. Yet the tank itself was undamaged from the outside. That's how armored warfare really looked. From a distance, a tank could appear untouched, still facing the enemy while inside it had become a tomb. Hollywood's version erases that grim reality because it's not spectacular enough. Fireballs draw applause. Smoke and silence do not. But if you ask the men who lived it, or didn't, they'll tell you the truth was worse. A tank didn't need to explode to be deadly. It only needed to be hit once in the wrong place by the right kind of shell. As one British gunner put it after Normandy, when you saw a tank burning, you knew something went terribly wrong. But when you saw it just sitting there still and quiet, that was worse. That meant everyone inside was already gone. And that's the grim side of real tank combat. Not explosions, not spectacle, just sudden, silent finality. After 8 decades of film, fantasy, and fiery explosions, what's left when we scrape away Hollywood's armor-plated illusions? The truth is quieter, slower, and infinitely more terrifying. Real armored warfare wasn't a ballet of roaring engines and flaming duels. It was a contest of nerves, fought at walking pace between men half-blind inside metal coffins. In the movies, tank crews are heroes in motion, charging, firing, ramming, emerging from the smoke. In reality, they were calculating survival in seconds. Move too fast and you missed. Stay too long and you died. Every maneuver was geometry under fire. Every shot was arithmetic: angle, distance, thickness, penetration. Crews didn't duel like knights. They waited, aimed, and hoped their first round struck true. Most never saw the tank that killed them. Many never even knew where the shot came from. And when the end came, it wasn't the inferno we see on screen. No mushroom clouds, no flying turrets. Just a single hit, a sudden jolt, and silence. Inside, steel splinters did the work of fireballs. Invisible, unstoppable, final. That's the part Hollywood never shows. The stillness after death. The tank that looks intact but holds 5 men who will never climb out. War movies need spectacle. Audiences crave noise and light. But in doing so, they bury the real story of courage, the patience, precision, and quiet terror of men who fought inside machines designed to protect them, but so often became their graves. The myths endure because they're cinematic. The reality endures because it was lived. Every veteran's account, every burned-out hull, every name etched into a forgotten plate of armor reminds us that tank warfare wasn't a thrill ride. It was a slow-motion slaughter. So the next time you see a tank on screen tearing through buildings, firing on the move, or bursting into flames, remember this. Real crews didn't live that myth. They endured something far harder and far more human. No glory, no fireballs, just the quiet math of survival inside a box of steel.